Hi everyone, welcome to the second part of Chapter 9. In this part we're going to talk about population, politics, and the economy of sub-Saharan Africa, and we'll start with population. So there are about 847 million people in the region, but it's very low density. So most of the people in the area living in very rural places. And if we look at kind of the differences, again, we're talking about the poorest region in the world. So we look at a place like Niger, extremely poor, has a human development index of 0.2. Remember, 1 is perfect. Very, very high rate of natural increase. A lot of population growth there, but also very, very low percentage of people living in urban settings, only 17%. You have, so that's Niger, which is very poor. You have a place like Ghana, which has a much higher human development index, still fairly low, but much, much higher than Niger. And the reason for that is political stability. And so in this region, political stability really goes a long way into garnering outside investment and helping a country industrialize and grow. And what we're going to see throughout this lecture is that there is a ton of political instability in the region, which has really kind of prevented a lot of industrialization. Um, and some other differences in the area, we look at Equatorial Guinea, which has a pretty high per capita income. They have oil, um, right, as opposed to a place like Rwanda, which does not, which is very dense actually, but still very, very rural. So larger population for the area, but still extraordinarily rural, only 19% living in urban settings. And so again, where do most Africans live? Where they can grow food, right? 68% rural as a region as a whole. And this is especially in volcanic soil. You have higher populations in East Africa. Rwanda is more dense than India, but however, 81% rural. So farmland there is divided into smaller and smaller patches. Also, people living in river valleys, like in Lagos on the bottom here. For example, in Nigeria, you have 188 million people. Right, you can only really have these dense populations in regions that are really, really good for growing food, and a lot of the region is not really good for growing food. The HIV/AIDS epidemic has devastated many, many countries in the region. It's slowed down population growth compared to places like India and China. This is especially true in the far south. And so it removes human capital. The HIV/AIDS epidemic has removed a large portion of the working population in some countries. We'll look at Botswana on the next slide as an example. But you wind up with, unfortunately, lots of orphans and lots of young adults dying from AIDS. So there are millions of orphans, very few workers, and this can be reinforced by lack of education about the spread of HIV and AIDS. There's tons of misinformation out there. Some of the worst of which is that you can cure HIV or AIDS by having sex with a virgin, which actually has led to in the increased spread of the disease. There's also cultural barriers between women being able to ask men to wear a condom during sex. We also have a lot of migrant workers in the area. In many countries, it's pretty common for men to leave for long periods of time for work, and this can lead to lots of promiscuity while they're away, contracting HIV and AIDS, and then again, those wives not being able to ask their husbands to wear protection when they come back. So again, misinformation around the disease or no information at all. Treatment is too expensive for most. There is a antiviral cocktail of medication that you can take that can really change your life expectancy to be similar to somebody who does not have the disease, and it is much less expensive in the United States than it is in sub-Saharan Africa. Good leadership helps. Countries that have kind of embraced platforms about safe sex have done much better. Bad leadership can make it worse. In some countries, again, misinformation about what causes HIV and AIDS or how to cure it can really make that disease spread much more rapidly. And when we look at a map here showing the infection rates, again, lots in the southern part of the region, but a country like Botswana, which has one of the highest infection rates, we can see our population bubble here again, what it would be like without HIV/AIDS. You can see a huge portion of the working population has been removed due to the AIDS epidemic. There are some settlement patterns in the region. Again, like many other regions, there is lots of urbanization happening, but villages are still most common. Rather than living in cities, to be in that rural setting. Again, 68% of the people there are in this rural setting. Many of these cities were only founded during the colonial period, so they're fairly new. So they have this modern core, as you can see in Nairobi, but then huge slums on the outskirts, which we have seen in some other places. But a lot of these cities are growing rapidly, especially Nairobi and Accra in Ghana. So lots more people moving to the city to look for work. I just want to touch on a bit apartheid in South Africa. South Africa had a policy of apartheid where blacks and minorities were kind of forced to live in less desirable neighborhoods, and the most desirable neighborhoods in urban areas and the best farmland were reserved for a white minority. Excuse me, I said minority a second ago, which is not true. Whites are the minority in South Africa. And so this was a settler colony. It's one of the only places in Africa where Europeans came, colonized, and stayed. Urban blacks, coloreds, and Asians were forced to live in places called townships. And rural blacks were sent to forced to live in places called homelands. You can see here is a picture of a township. Quite poor as opposed to, very urban and modern Cape Town. Here's a wealthy beach suburb here. And so these patterns still exist today, even though apartheid has ended and is no longer an official policy. This legacy remains where you see most blacks and coloreds and Asians being forced to live in these regions. And so anyone can live anywhere now, but there's still this de facto segregation that is going on. By the way, in South Africa, the term coloreds is used to refer to somebody of mixed race. It has a very different meaning in the United States and is no longer used as a term, but in South Africa, it is a term used to mean anybody of mixed race descent. When we look at the political geography of the situation, and again, here's a map of the region. The newly created country of South Sudan is part of this region because it is primarily Christian. Sudan was included in the region of the Middle East and North Africa. So we have 57 countries on the continent and the surrounding islands, like Madagascar here. And so who drew the borders? This guy, if you watch the tongue-in-cheek thing, which hopefully you did about the Middle East, right, these borders were primarily drawn by Europeans, which I'll talk about in a second, with very little regard for any type of tribal affiliation or religion or anything else, which has led to conflicts today. And so when we look at colonialism, there were a couple of huge effects. First, hundreds of years of European and Arab slave trading, which I talked a little bit about at the beginning of the semester, along the coast. So massive amounts of people removed from the continent and transported as slaves. Some made the journey, some made it through the journey, some did not. But massive amounts of people removed. And then in the 1800s, there was this exploration of the interior, this European scramble for Africa for its resources. And it was about trade and not settlement. So these were mercantile colonies mostly, with the exception of South Africa, where Europeans did settle into that nice kind of Mediterranean climate that exists there. And there was the Conference of Berlin that took place between 1884 and 1885, where European powers got together basically in a room and divided up the continent with little knowledge of it, and that has had lasting effects today. Um, so when we look at colonial Africa in 1914, everywhere but Ethiopia was colonized. And Ethiopia, even though it wasn't colonized, it was occupied by Italy for quite some time. And so the borders we see today reflect this colonial history. So they're not exactly the same today, but certainly very similar. And so if we look at, this is the Murdoch map of African ethnic groups, right? We have massive amounts of different ethnic groups living in the region. It is incredibly diverse. And in many places, there's more loyalty to your tribe or ethnic group than to your country. So most conflicts in the region um, take place between ethnic groups within a country. There are very few international conflicts. So it is more about these ethnic groups fighting within countries, very often as a result of the way some of them were treated during colonialism, which I'll talk about when I talk about Rwanda. But you also have ethnic groups, again, if you look at this map, that were divided up based upon these European borders that were drawn. And so, in many places, there's kind of been this imposing of the nation state. This is a picture of the Gambia where that has certainly happened. But because these borders were drawn kind of artificially, and these capitals created, and these European bureaucracies um, remained, this kind of impeded traditional migratory patterns in the region. So people were kind of forced to stay within a particular state. Again, no regard for ethnicity, and some people were separated. Many groups existed within states. And so the big idea here is that the geopolitical and economic issues stem from a cultural geography and colonial policies and boundaries. So when I talk about Rwanda, a large part of the conflict in Rwanda and the unfortunate genocide that occurred there had to do with one ethnic group being favored among another during colonial rule. And so very often when you have elections that are occurring in these countries, people are voting strictly among ethnic or tribal lines rather than, along country lines. Language in the area also very diverse, similar diversity that we saw in Asia. South Africa, for example, has 11 official languages. The Democratic Republic of Congo has 240 languages that are spoken within its borders. Those colonial languages, such as French or English, are the lingua franca, so it's not uncommon for somebody to speak their tribal language or regional language and then that colonial language as well. There are some native language that are emerging now as being more popular, becoming more of these lingua francas or languages of government and commerce, such as Swahili or Lingala. Religion in the region, again, a lot of uh, religion diversity. So we have Islam in the north, in the Sahel, and on the eastern coast. These are areas of Arab influence and became Muslim pre-colonial times. Lots of Christianity was spread in the south by missionaries. This is mostly a colonial legacy, except Ethiopia. Ethiopia has one of the oldest Christian churches, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Also, still lots of animist and tribal beliefs that are often blended with Christianity or Islam or exist on their own throughout the region. So again, often blending with Christianity or Islam. And we see this conflict in the Sahel, in the northern part of the region, where you have Christianity and Islam kind of butting up against each other and then mixing again with these animist beliefs. The genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s um, was largely due to this colonial legacy. So there were two main ethnic groups in the region, the Hutus and the Tutsis. They spoke the same language, they practiced the same religion, and they were really racialized by the Belgians when they occupied the region. And so these two groups were coexisted quite happily for a very long time. Um, but the there while there is a Hutu majority in the country, the Tutsis were traditionally in power because they were favored by the Belgians because they were thought to look more European and less African. So there was a lot of resentment that brewed from that. And then you also have a land scarcity in the area, right? More and more people living in the area. There's lots of ability to grow food there, but not since the population is growing, there's not a lot of farmland left. So people are farming on smaller and smaller plots of land. And so there was a genocide of the Tutsis in 1994. I highly recommend. There's several really good films about it, including Hotel Rwanda and Sometimes in April. But this terrible genocide that occurred where Hutus kind of turned on Tutsis, um, and it was broadcast over the radio. And Rwanda has really made a big attempt to heal this divide and kind of acknowledge the genocide that happened and move their country forward. And so there's been a big reconciliation since, but millions of people died during this event with little intervention from the international community. And so we do have foreign involvement in ethnic conflicts, but that intervention is actually pretty rare unless there is some type of resource that a Western country is extracting that then is under threat. There's also proxy wars that are pretty common. Lots of fights occurred there between kind of communist and democratic forces. On the right here, we see Che Guevara, who you may have heard of, who we will talk about when we talk about Latin America, in Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. In 1965, he was a revolutionary and came there to help rebels fight. So this especially happened during the Cold War. There are lots of um, guns and ammunition and tanks left in the region due to this kind of flood of weapons that happened during the Cold War and all of these little proxy wars that took place. I spent some time in Ethiopia, and there are many, many, many guns in rural areas. I saw lots of AK-47s are pretty common in some very rural areas. The economy of the region, it is dominated by agriculture, again, still predominantly rural, but it's mostly subsistence agriculture. So not this industrial agriculture that we see in other regions, but people mostly growing food mostly for themselves, maybe selling small bits of it. There is an increase in cash crops now for export, things like coffee, cocoa, tea, tobacco, sugarcane, and cashews, which are then sold out rather than food, which can mess with food security in the region. So there's a heavy reliance on single exports, where you have countries just specializing in one cash crop and exporting it out usually to Western countries. So things like peanuts in the Gambia, coffee in Kenya and Ethiopia, which is the birthplace of coffee. A lot of coffee shops you can go to and they will have some type of Kenyan or Ethiopian coffee. And they can be problems if those price drops. So coffee prices are very, very volatile in the international market, and those farmers are usually making the smallest amount on it. So buying things like fair trade coffee ensures that those coffee farmers are getting the best price for their coffee and a consistent price for their coffee. Mineral resources are abundant in the region, which I'll talk a little bit more beginning, but there is kind of this false narrative about Africa that one of the reasons it's so poor is that there aren't really a lot of resources, and that's not true. But there is a lot of difficulty attracting foreign investment due to things like low rates of literacy, political instability, and also bad infrastructure. There's a picture of a road in South Sudan. Right? Unless a country is politically stable, people don't want to invest there because they're worried about losing those investments if there's a coup or a war, and also, having the infrastructure to export your goods out. Um, Lots of food insecurity in the region, lots of hungry people. It struggles to feed itself for a few reasons. Again, because of that agriculture land in a lot of places not being ideal. Very often the climate and soils are not good to farm in. And climate change has affected here first, really, as far as agriculture. I have a friend who has studied food security in Africa and interviewed farmers in rural Ghana who already are adjusting what they do due to climate change. Again, that food security also affected by political and economic stability. So very often when food aid comes in, it can be kind of hijacked by local warlords that will use it to leverage power. This problem is region-wide, but it is worst in the Horn of Africa. There's a picture on the bottom there of the Ethiopian famine in the 1980s, which brought about global attention. And during the Ethiopian famine, there was enough food in Ethiopia to eat, but it was not able to reach people who needed it. And very often, some of the food was being grown for export because they could get better prices on the open market than they could. So people not being able to afford the food that is grown in their own country. And so there's been this system that's kind of set up countries being reliant on aid and loans in order to feed themselves. And again, this is largely has to do with the legacy of colonialism. So lots of mineral resources in the region, primarily in three places. So again, this is not why the region is poor. It doesn't have to do with its lack of resources. It's concentrated in three main regions along the west coast, in the central southern-ish part of the region, and then in the south itself. But most Western companies gain the most wealth out of this. And this has to do with something called neocolonialism. And so neocolonialism is that the idea that why colonialism is technically over and these places are no longer colonies, we have that system set in place where Western countries are able to gain the most from those resources, export those resources out. This includes things like oil, but also there are many precious metals that are used in electronics, including your cell phones, that are taken from this region, and diamonds as well. And so Africa has been called a victim to this idea of the resource curse. So the presence of valuable resource doesn't benefit the average person. Instead, it results in instability and environmental problems. So we see children doing mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We see an oil pipeline in Nigeria where somebody's basically using it to dry their laundry, but they're certainly not benefiting from that oil wealth. And then again, the effects of blood diamonds in places like Sierra Leone, where very, very poor people are being used to harvest these diamonds. And then if they are suspected of or caught stealing any of these diamonds from the mines, again, they're being paid very, very little to extract something that is going to fetch a large price on the international market. Lots of people, unfortunately, would lose their hands as retribution for stealing those diamonds. Inflation in the region has also been a problem in some countries, especially Zimbabwe, which has been in the news a lot lately. Your next exercise is going to be all about Zimbabwe. So bad leaders, when they need money, they just print more. And what happens is when you print more money, that money loses its value. So Zimbabwe at one point had a 516 quintillion% inflation rate. They had bills that were basically $100 trillion. Here's somebody taking some money just to go to the store to buy a few things. So obviously inflation going up and up and up, not very good for the economy. Zimbabwe now mainly uses American dollars. And this leads to this kind of black market exchange of goods because people can't keep all of this money um, and can't keep up with that inflation. So corruption kind of dominates. There are also problems with a lot of preventable diseases in the region, including things like malaria. It's an economic issue as well as a health and moral issue. Bill Gates has been very involved with preventing the spread of malaria in Africa through giving out very simple mosquito netting, like you see here in the bottom right. But you have insect and waterborne diseases that kill hundreds of thousands of people annually, um, especially things that you do not see in more developed countries like cholera. This has a lot to do with bad infrastructure and being able to have good drinking water. Cheap solutions do exist, though. We see up at the right there this woman using a very simple water filter that filters out those waterborne diseases in order to drink water from a local waterway. Um, but when you have poor education or poor healthcare systems, this can lead to bigger outbreaks of disease. For example, the Ebola outbreak that occurred a few years ago now, where the healthcare systems were just not able to uh, keep up and take care of in a medically necessary fashion to prevent the spread of Ebola. Ebola is actually really, really hard to spread. It is not an airborne disease. You need to contract it through kind of contact with bodily fluids, such as blood. And so when you are lacking the sanitary conditions of a good healthcare system, that can aid in the spread of the disease. So again, lots of political instability in parts of the region, but political stability leads to investment, like in Ghana. Ghana has had free and fair elections since the 1980s. They get high marks for freedom of the press, actually higher than the US does. And that economy is growing rapidly, 8% annual growth, which is a really rapid growth rate. And so you also have this tourist sector growing there, lots of international investment. This is a tourist region in Ghana. The coast of Ghana is quite beautiful. And they have some of the highest life expectancy in the mainland region because of that, because of this political stability, increased economic investment, and then increases in infrastructure. But stability can be really hard to achieve in lots of the region. Due to these legacies of colonialism, some people being in power for a really, really long time, some people only being in power for a few days. And your next exercise is going to be about Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. But there are reasons for optimism in the area. Examples for success are visible, and they often happen through simple solutions rather than large panaceas. And so there's a picture on the bottom right there of a company called Afripads in Uganda, which is actually run by a friend's daughter. And so what this company does is they employ local women to create reusable sanitary napkins, and they partner with a U.S. company, and they give these sanitary napkins to young girls because what often happens in many places in the region is that once a girl starts menstruating, she cannot go to school because she doesn't have the ability to go to school during her period because she doesn't have the means um, to do that, and this provides that. And so what happens is after girls start missing more and more school, they wind up dropping out of school. This often leads to girls not only not having access to education, but marrying younger, having larger families, and unfortunately leading to more poverty in the region, especially among women. So this organization benefits in a couple ways. One, by employing these women, but also by helping these girls stay in school and complete school. And so this is our last slide for this chapter. Next, you're going to move on to your next exercise.